This video is brought to you by Imprint. Over the past few years, the silver lining for the CCP has been that, even while China's domestic economy has slumped, exports and industry have held up relatively well. However, a vicious combination of new protectionist measures aimed against Chinese exports and an acute slowdown in local government spending have now pushed hundreds of thousands of industrial enterprises into the red, putting the last bastion of Chinese economic strength under strain. So in this video, we're going to have a look at how China's economic crisis has finally spread to its industry, and why neither of the two obvious remedies are easy for the CCP. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's just start by looking at the data. Every year, China's National Bureau of Statistics surveys over 500,000 industrial businesses to get a sense of how the economy is doing. According to these surveys, between 1998 and 2010, the percentage of firms making a loss fell steadily. This was when China was establishing itself as the factory of the world. In the first few years of its industrial deployment, there were a fair few bad apples, and things weren't helped by the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s. But as international demand for Chinese goods grew and successful industrial companies outcompeted the bad ones, the fraction of loss-making enterprises fell steadily. However, while this number remained relatively flat until about 2020, in the past few years it's begun to spike. The original uptick was probably largely to do with the pandemic, but over the past 2 years, the fraction of loss-making firms has continued to increase, and actually at a faster rate, going from 20% in 2022 to about 30% in June of this year. This matches the previous high in 1998, although it's worth mentioning that the percentage of loss-making firms often peaks in the middle of the year and falls by the end. Last year, for instance, the fraction of loss-making firms peaked at 29% in June, before falling to 21% by December. Nonetheless, it's still true to say that the percentage of loss-making firms is increasing, and is now at its highest level in more than 20 years. This would concur with other sector-specific reports we've seen recently. Last week, for instance, the world's biggest steel producer, China Baowu Steel Group, described market conditions as like a harsh winter, and warned that this year would be the industry's most difficult since 1998. Data from July suggests steel production has fallen by 4% year on year, while cement production, usually a good proxy of manufacturing activity more widely, has fallen by 12.4%. While a handful of Chinese EV companies like BYD have done remarkably well, their headline-grabbing success masks a wider malaise, and at least 8 large makers of the cars have shut down or halted production in the past 18 months, thanks to weak exports and slowing domestic demand. Obviously, this can't be attributed to the pandemic, so what's going on here? Well, as we see it, there are 3 main reasons. The first is declining international demand for Chinese goods, both because the global economy is slowing down and because of the ongoing expansion of anti-Chinese tariffs. As we explained in a previous video, developed countries like America and the European Union obviously have some tariffs on Chinese goods, but recently a number of developing countries, who are now also anxious that a flood of Chinese exports could undermine their own domestic industries, have also joined in. This year alone, Mexico, Chile and Brazil have hiked tariffs on Chinese steel products, and in July, Turkey announced that it would be imposing an additional 40% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. More recently, Indonesia announced tariffs of up to 200% on Chinese textile products, and South Africa has imposed a 10% tariff on all solar panels, cells and modules from China. This has been compounded by weak domestic demand. Again, as we've mentioned in other videos, many people think that China's fundamental economic problem is the fact that Chinese households and consumers don't make enough money. This is why Chinese businesses have to rely so heavily on export, because domestic demand for goods is too weak. Anyway, since China's economic crisis began a few years ago, multiple commentators, including the IMF, have suggested that China resolve its imbalance by increasing domestic demand, perhaps by providing direct stimulus to households or to real estate developers, because many Chinese households aren't spending because they're now worried about paying down their overpriced mortgage. However, Xi and the CCP apparently disagree. Instead, they've doubled down on manufacturing and industry, which Xi has started calling new productive forces, which means Chinese industry can't replace the shortfall in international demand for Chinese exports with domestic demand. Things only look likely to get worse as well. The latest bank lending data suggests that household spending and borrowing has fallen to lows not seen since 2008. The third reason is local governments. In the past, local governments have played an important role in keeping Chinese industry afloat, handing out tons of cash via subsidies and government contracts. However, in part because lots of tax revenue goes straight to Beijing, local government used to fund this spending by essentially leasing out government land to developers via shell companies known as local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs. As the property crisis has escalated, demand for new land has collapsed, with land sales falling by nearly 50% since 2021. At the same time, because these LGFVs have taken on massive amounts of debt, Beijing has told many of these local governments to cut down on spending, with heavily indebted provinces like Guizhou cutting spending by over 50%. According to documents obtained by the Financial Times, 10 of China's 33 provinces now have debt burdens representing over 50% of GDP, with 4 representing over 100% of GDP. And just servicing this debt, i.e. paying off the interest, is now costing 8 provinces literally all of their tax revenues. Anyway, this belt tightening has been bad news for Chinese industry, because local government spending used to represent one of their main sources of revenue. This has also been exacerbated by the unprecedented drop in foreign investment, which has actually gone negative for the first time since 1990, as international investors pull money out of the country. So, is there any way to resolve this crisis? Well, broadly speaking, there are 2 ways that the CCP might go about trying to fix this problem, and neither are easy. The first is to stimulate domestic demand. But restoring confidence in the property sector or rebalancing the economy towards consumption won't be easy. And the most obvious political prescription, direct stimulus to households or developers, has already been essentially ruled out. The second is to try to convince the rest of the world to continue absorbing China's surplus exports. But this looks basically impossible, at least without substantial reforms to the pre-existing international trade bodies like the WTO or an entirely new trade settlement. If you want to keep learning, the best way is through Imprint. That's the brand new way to learn built from the ground up. And seriously, unless you've used the app before, you likely haven't experienced something like this. That's because Imprint is beautifully illustrated and animated, creating a highly visual, effective, and interactive learning experience built for bite-sized learning. You can take advantage of their expansive library of courses, book summaries, and articles to learn about psychology, philosophy, leadership, the science of happiness, productivity systems, finance, science, technology, health, and wellness, history, and more. Plus, you can learn about these things quickly, with most individual lessons taking a few minutes to complete. That speed doesn't mean it's light on information either. Imprint is built around the science of learning, so it helps to build habits around learning, utilizes high-quality visuals to boost understanding, as well as letting users learn at their own pace. Ultimately, Imprint is a way to feel good about your screen time and learn something new, rather than just mindlessly scrolling on social media. Stop doom scrolling, start learning. So join the millions of users learning with Imprint by clicking the link in the description. The first 200 people to sign up will get 20% off an annual plan. Plus, they'll know you came from us.